Okay, I have with me today former CIA agent Larry Johnson. We've had him on before, and you guys really enjoyed his feedback and commentary. He's agreed to come on again. Larry, thank you so much for your time and coming on today's show.
Thanks, Stephen.
So, we're going to talk about the Russia Ukraine situation. We're going to talk about NATO, the Biden family, lots of different topics. So, again, I appreciate you coming on. Let me just start off with an obvious, mind boggler for most people. But why is the president of the United States going on national TV, global TV, and saying that Russia has lost this war,
Yeah.
that Ukraine is going to win? And then his Secretary of State is also going around saying that Russia has already lost.
Yeah.
Why are these two feeding the American people these lies?
I've likened it to the movie The Princess Bride, and in it we got this actor William Shawn playing the character. He keeps saying inconceivable, and finally the one Spanish guy looks at him and goes, "I don't think you know what that word means."
Yeah.
And that's the situation with Biden and Blinken, because what would constitute a loss for Russia? Well, they could have material losses of manpower. Well, that's not happening. How do you know that? Well, very simple. I follow social media in both Russia and Ukraine. There are no images of massive graveyards being dug and planted around Russia. That's one way you would know that there were major casualties. You see those in Ukraine. In fact, they're having to dig up World War II bodies to plant the new bodies. It's so massive. So that's one way to lose. Losing equipment, not being able to supply your troops with food, with ammunition, with artillery shells. Well, that's not Russia. Russia has ample supplies. That's Ukraine. In fact, Joe Biden admitted, "Yeah, we've run out of artillery shells, so we got to send these cluster munitions. That's all we got left in the cupboard." How about combat air? Russia losing would mean that it could no longer field combat aircraft to cover its troops on the front line. Nope, that's not happening either. The Russians are shooting down everything the Ukrainians have. Ditto for helicopters. Ditto for mobile artillery. Ditto for mobile air defense. So on any thing you could measure tangibly, Russia has not been losing. How about territory? Again, they keep claiming that Russia is losing territory. Well, that's just not true. Even the Ukrainian map, live UA map, shows that Russia is, in the past couple of weeks, has been steadily advancing after thwarting, stopping cold the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So, what other ways could we define loss? Well, that the population of Russia are up in anger. They're marching in the streets. They're burning buildings. They're attacking police. They're protesting the war. That's not happening either in Russia. Just the opposite. Putin enjoys like 80% public approval. Well, another loss would be losing friends internationally, being isolated, that you can't trade, nobody will touch you. Well, Russia's hosting an Africa conference today in St. Petersburg with 53 nations, I believe. It's got an alliance, a de facto alliance with China. So so at the end of the day, this is Blinken. You can excuse Biden because he's demented. He's got Alzheimer's disease or some sort of advanced dementia. What's Blinken's excuse? He's a liar. And there's no other way to couch this. It's not to be calling names, but when you are that divorced from reality and people are getting killed as a result of it, you can't excuse it and soft pedal it.
Yeah, I've wondered if maybe Blinken is just in over his head, and on top of everything going on because of this administration, he's just borrowing acting skills from Zelensky and putting on a strong face and trying to personify a person of power and knowledge, but is this guy just in over his head?
Yeah, he's like the organ grinder's monkey. You ever, recall the old, it'd grind the organ and the monkey would dance around?
Oh,
That's Blinken. He dances so he gets fed.
okay.
He gets rewarded. He gets to be part of the club. God forbid that he would stand up and actually speak truth.
Yeah.
Because he's not lacking in intellectual skill in terms of book smarts.
Yeah.
But this kind of moral emptiness that allows him to just so blatantly and flagrantly lie is disgusting.
Yeah. Let's talk about the counteroffensive that I've been covering it since January. It's finally here. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says it's actually going better than people realize because Ukraine has taken back 50% of the territory. But my guess is they haven't taken it back. Russia's just left the area, and maybe they're considering that. But in your view, with your level of intelligence and understanding, how is the counteroffensive going? And then I'll come with the follow-up question, but basically, why was this being announced from the rooftops for so many months? Like, it just seems like they let the enemy know exactly what they were going to do, and then all of their weaknesses.
Yeah, it was. They were treating it like it was a summer blockbuster, that coming soon to a theater near you in July, the Mission Impossible or, whatever the big movie is now. It's sort of the Harrison Ford, I guess the last Indiana Jones movie was a bit of a flop. Well, the much ballyhooed Ukrainian counteroffensive that was going to be brought to theaters near you in the summer, it has come, and it is a complete disaster, a complete flop. And it goes back to your second question, like, why in God's name, if you're really going to launch an offensive, would you announce it in advance? I mean, these guys are not Babe Ruth, pointing to center field and saying, hey, I'm going to put the ball out there and then hits it. Okay. It's not like Mike Tyson telegraphing, okay, I'm going to hit you there. Or you remember the iconic scene, maybe you don't, you're too young for it, from the movie Billy Jack, where the Billy Jack character says, guy, I'm gonna take my right foot here and put it on your face right there, and there's not a thing you can do about it. Ukraine's none of those. So they announce in advance what they're doing, and yet, myself, Scott Ritter, Doug Macgregor, we're looking and scratching our heads like, okay, to conduct this kind of offensive, number one, you need to have fixed-wing aircraft. The combat air that can provide close air support, which means planes firing down at Russian positions to force the Russians to go into hiding or to try to suppress Russian fire. Well, Ukraine didn't have that. Or you'd need combat helicopters that could fly close enough to the front to take out Russian armored vehicles and Russian artillery emplacements. They didn't have that. They would need to have mobile air defense so that as their columns are advancing, these air defense units come behind and can shoot down any Russian aircraft that are coming to bomb them. They didn't have that. And last but not least, ample supplies of mobile artillery. So it's like, what? You're going to run an offensive and without the essential elements? Now, we've heard Zelensky complain, and maybe I think it was Zaluzhny complain that, we got coerced into doing this offensive and we didn't have what we needed. Well, there's some truth to that. They're actually, for once, telling the truth. The West, this is all about a political show for the West, because what people don't appreciate is this entire use of Ukraine as a proxy to fight Russia. This plan started years ago. The overthrow of the Russian-supported government in Ukraine, the installation of a Western-supported government in Ukraine in 2014, followed up by the launching of attacks against the Donbass. The Russians responded by providing some reinforcements through, I think, groups like the Wagner forces. Fought it to a standstill, but every year since then, 2015, 2016, 2017, NATO or the U.S. European Command conducted military exercises with Ukraine. Why? Because even though Ukraine's not a member of NATO, it is a de facto member of NATO. It gets treated like part of the club, even though it doesn't have the card and this personal locker and access after hours. Why would they do that? Because after the United States, the Ukrainian army represented the largest force in NATO. It was larger than what Turkey had. And when you put together Turkey and or Ukraine and then Turkey and the United States, that constitutes like 80% of the total forces that NATO can commit in a possible engagement. So Ukraine was clearly seen as this proxy that they were going to use to try to dismantle Russia. And in fact, the West genuinely believed that they could use Ukraine in this fashion and that Ukraine would defeat Russia, because the West convinced itself Russia's got incompetent military leadership. Russia's got poor morale amongst its troops. Its conscripts are forced to join against their will. They don't have adequate logistics. They don't have adequate weapon systems, and on and on and on. And the West really bought in and believed this crap. Well, now they're reaping the reward. They're finding out that Ukraine's army, that was once number 2 de facto wise in NATO, has been wiped out. They've got over approaching 600,000 casualties. That represents almost 50% of the manpower that was present at the start of Russia's special military operation in February of 2022. So what we're seeing here is this desperate attempt, because the West wants Ukraine to succeed against Russia for the politics, in order to assuage concerns in their respective countries about the possibility that this is a completely feckless, futile effort.
Okay. Wow. You brought up some names that I deal with, Colonel Macgregor and the lack of ammunition. During an interview between journalists Clayton Morris at Redacted and Colonel Douglas Macgregor, he mentioned how cluster bombs being sent by the United States are now falling into the hands of the Russian military, or are ending up on the black market and being sold. But now these very weapons that the United States is sending over and turning a blind eye to how damaging and illegal they are, Russia's now receiving those and using them against Ukraine. Have you heard anything like this, or did I mishear this?
No, I heard Doug say that, and I don't. It's not so much that Russia may be getting some of the U.S. munitions, but Russia has its own. It has its own stockpiles. They would be more likely to use their own against these troop emplacements now that Ukraine has crossed that red line. Russia, to my understanding, was not using those cluster munitions prior to this, and the reason they're condemned widely around the world is that because they look like a little baseball that you can hold in your hand, a kid's going to pick it up, or a teenager, and they're going to blow off their arm, leg, hand, or kill themselves. So it's not a humane weapon. And the real problem with what the United States has provided is they sat in warehouses for so long that they were showing that the dead rate was only 1%. That meant out of 100, only one's going to fail. No, I think it's going to be much higher. It could be as high as 20-25%.
Wow. Yeah, I hope to not be reporting on those stories in the future. I hate hearing about the kids, but we're going to talk about that later in this interview. In the past week, Admiral Kirby from the Pentagon announced that F-16 jets from the United States will be provided, but not until late December of 2023. So probably another 5 months from now. But in the same breath, he says we're not under the belief that they're going to change the tide of the war. What are your thoughts on these F-16s that are supposedly going to change the war, but now we're being told they're not going to change the tide of the war? What is this, just symbolism? Is this propaganda? Is this ever going to come to fruition?
That symbolic gesture designed to benefit more U.S. defense contractors will have zero effect on the battlefield. In fact, even Mark Milley, General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, just the other day, commented extensively on the fact, well, okay, yeah, we're going to send maybe 20 F-16s, but it's going to take a while to train the pilots. It's going to take a while to get there. And meanwhile, Russia has thousands of combat aircraft that can defeat the F-16. It is just, so it's not going to make any difference on the battlefield. It'll just be a new toy that the Russians get to destroy. So it'll be one more reminder that in this special military operation that was initially intended to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine is also demilitarizing NATO and exploding as a myth the prowess and competence of NATO equipment and NATO forces. There's not a single NATO weapon system that has been introduced into this conflict that has changed the course of the battles. Not one.
Yeah.
So, excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead, take a drink. So, I mean, that brings me to my next question. Do you believe members of NATO, especially the United States, who basically runs NATO, believe the Ukrainian army could defeat the Russian army? Or do you think in the beginning of this conflict, they had hoped that this U.S.-trained Ukrainian military could at least defend the position until Vladimir Putin gave up?
Let's go back a year ago. All the NATO partners, I think, genuinely believed that Ukraine was going to be triumphing over Russia. They bought into their own propaganda. The problem with the Ukrainian army is that it was not U.S. trained. It's been trained by at least 9 different countries. And when you've got 9 different countries, basically you got 9 different standards. You don't have a consistent course of instruction for the various disciplines and approaches. The Germans have a way of doing things, as do the French, as do the Brits, as do the Italians, as do the Dutch, as do the United States. We do things differently in different ways on certain issues. And so Ukraine is sort of presented with a schizophrenic approach to training. They had multiple teachers and no way to integrate it, bring it together. What has now been exposed over the last 6 months is that the Russian army that was supposedly going to run out of ammunition any time now, that has been announced with regularity going back to March of 2022, well, they're not running out. Their defense industry is operating 24/7, producing volumes of missiles that the United States, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom combined cannot match. Cannot even if they started today to try to do it, they can't match it. Yeah, and in fact, it's gotten so bad in the United States. Wall Street Journal ran an article the other day about Stanley Craftsman Tools, who built a factory outside of Dallas to build wrenches. Think of this, wrenches, tools. And the factory failed. They couldn't build it. They couldn't make the wrench. So the United States has gone from being a superpower industrially during World War II to now it can't even make a damn wrench in the United States. So, up against all of this, Ukraine they're going to be faced with having to build the 4th version of their army. And I think we talked about this the last time we were together, that it's just like anytime you take the original, you make a copy. Copy's not 100% with the original. Then if you make a copy of the copy, then you compare the second generation copy with the original, well, it's even further deterioration. And then you go to the fourth generation or the third generation copy, and well, that's exactly what's happening to Ukraine's army, because each copy, each new iteration means they don't have as many experienced officers. They don't have as many experienced trained troops. They have more inexperienced, more untrained personnel with each generation. And this creates a death spiral, because that lack of training and lack of ability to conduct any kind of maneuver warfare means more and more of them are going to die, as is happening right now. The casualty rate in Ukraine for the Ukrainian soldiers right now is catastrophic. There's no other way to describe it.